name is Mary Sue Barrett, and I'm president of the Metropolitan Planning Council, and I'm just delighted to have such an amazing turnout on a gorgeous Thursday evening. And I hope for some of you that are returning to the DuSable Museum, you're enjoying it, and I suspect there's a few people who have never been here, and so I'm really grateful that you decided to join us. This event is part of a series of commemorative events about the 1919 race riots, organized by the Newberry Library, our partner, Lake Forest College, and of course our host tonight, the DuSable Museum of African American History. All of these institutions have a deep commitment, as does the Metropolitan Planning Council, to reflection, to learning, introspection, and then to banding together around change. We, at our core, consider ourselves change makers, and we have an important responsibility to take a look at our history. That's why we did the cost of segregation study a couple of years ago, to quantify in economic terms, if that was needed, and it turns out for some people it is, to put a cost on the economic and racial segregation that our region is infamous for, but then also to bring people together around a set of solutions. I was talking to colleagues here earlier at the DuSable Museum, and one of the things that you can see in the exhibit that will open this Saturday here at the museum is information about a series of recommendations that emerged. So this Saturday, July 27th, is the 100th anniversary of the July 27th beginning of a race riot because of Eugene Williams' stoning at a beach on Chicago's South Side. It was a white rage-induced attack, and this then occurred in a number of other cities over what became known as the Red Summer. So it is a deeply reflective moment to be here 100 years to the date this weekend, and I encourage all of us to take this moment to rededicate ourselves to being change makers together. So tonight's about learning. Tonight's about challenging ourselves, and we have the perfect panel to do that. I do want to, on behalf of the DuSable Museum, not only tell you that the exhibit, which is today behind some barriers, only because we're serving you meatballs and stuff like that tonight, and we promise not to muss up their exhibit, but please do come back. It opens this Saturday, and the other thing that the DuSable Museum is organizing again this Saturday is a float at the beach where they are commemorating by a peaceful lake passage from what had been the white-black dividing line. And I think it's a very powerful and emotional way to mark this moment in our history, because until Newberry and Lake Forest College and others brought this project together with partners, I suspect many of us didn't learn about the 1919 race riots in our history classes. So thank you again for being part of this. I'll come back at the end after we hear from our panel and have some Q&A with a few announcements, and then we encourage you to stay and enjoy more drink and nibbles and conversation, because there's a really fascinating crowd here this evening. Thank you to all of you who are representing institutions that are so critical to the change that we're trying to achieve. And of course, I don't need to tell this crowd that this is a historic moment of political change for our state and our city, so we better seize it. Our moderator tonight is a friend and colleague, Juanita Irizarry. I'm just delighted that she agreed to do this. I think we met each other more than 25 years ago or so when she was working at the Resurrection Project, and then continued to work together when she was at Hispanic Housing. She's had a series of important positions, both in government, for example, working for Governor Pat Quinn, in philanthropy, working for the Chicago Community Trust. So probably quite a few of you have intersected with her deep knowledge and her passion and her energy that just kind of fills a room. I really admire that about Juanita. Today she is running executive director of Friends of the Parks, and an institution that she has brought her own imprint to as an important institution bringing about questions, change, and improvements to the park assets, which is, of course, one of the things we'll talk about tonight. Recently, they hosted a conference called Parks as Democracy, so I hope we'll have a chance to learn a little bit about that. And I turn it over to Juanita to get our panel underway. Thank you.
Good evening. Am I on? Hello. Yes. Okay, great. Well, again, I just want to say thank you to the DuSable Museum for so kindly hosting us tonight, for the leadership that you've just heard about. And also, I wanted to acknowledge DuSable Museum as a partner along with Friends of the Parks in a 30-year battle that we have been taking on together as part of the DuSable Park Coalition to bring to fruition a park that was named by Harold Washington, our first African-American mayor, as DuSable Park after Jean-Baptiste Point DuSable, the first non-native settler of Chicago, who married a Potawatomi woman and settled at the confluence of the Chicago River and Lake Michigan. And 30 years later, that park is still not completed. DuSable Museum remains a partner. We think of that as an important equity issue to honor the black man who, along with his Native American wife, represent really the beginnings of what we now know as Chicago. So thank you to DuSable for fighting alongside us with that as well. So as for me, in addition to my role as Executive Director of Friends of the Parks, I come to this conversation as a Puerto Rican woman from Humboldt Park who would like to be at a party in Humboldt Park right now, celebrating a little change in Puerto Rico. Unbelievable. But my Puerto Ricanness was very much bolstered by my experience growing up in Humboldt Park in the neighborhood, but also the park itself, which so deeply embodies and is a home for a lot of our cultural expression, our community celebrations. And so I understand from my personal community's point of view how important our local parks can be. I also grew up playing kickball and softball, especially on the boulevards between Humboldt Park and Logan Square, because I was and still am a bit of a tomboy. But I came up in that neighborhood in decline in the 1970s and 80s and watched my neighborhood become pockmarked with vacant lots because of arson fires and management towards demolition. And that led me to be very interested in the built environment in my community, but also to systemic questions about why did not my neighborhood look the way that it did. And it led me into a career in affordable housing. So when I started at Friends of the Parks, a lot of people said, why are you at Friends of the Parks? I don't understand. But going back those years, when we were talking about what do we do with these vacant lots, we're going to build affordable housing, or we're going to create a community garden, we're going to take back this space as a community. And in addition to the park itself, the vacant lots and those spaces were an important part of our experience as green spaces in our community, or us turning them into green spaces. So for me, these things are all very connected. More recently, Humboldt Park is synonymous with the struggle with gentrification. That's one of the things we'll talk a little bit about today. And additionally, we now have the 606, which the neighborhood had dubbed the Bloomingdale Trail, but which the city insisted on naming otherwise. And for me personally, that has led to displacement, as my own rent went up $450 a month a year after the opening of the trail. So I'm now further away, though still within a long walk of the park, but by the time I get to the trail, I've already taken my walk, so I don't really walk on the trail. But I'm also just back from the City Parks Alliance conference, at which there was a lot of conversation about park equity. It's really a national conversation. And a lot of conversations about the displacement that increasingly comes up when major park investments are made. So these issues are not unique to Chicago. So I'm super excited about the conversation we're going to have this evening. So let's get started. And we're going to start with Tanika Johnson, who is an artist, co-founder of Rage. You're going to remind us what that means in a minute. An Englewood activist, resident, and an artist you may know for the Folded Map Project. And she'll tell you more about that as well. I was saying to Tanika as we prepared that when I watch her work and Rage's work and a lot of other folks I've gotten to know in Englewood, it reminds me a lot of our community struggle in Humboldt Park. To really invest in our spaces, make them public spaces, make them spaces that we love and are beloved to us, even if we're not getting the investment from the government. So I hand it to you, Tanika, to tell us a little bit about your story, maybe the folded map project, and run through a few of your slides.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. So RAGE is the Resident Association of Greater Englewood. And I am one of the 12 co-founders. The lead co-founder is Aisha Butler, who is also my dear friend. And the reason that we even started RAGE about 10 years ago was because we wanted to continue the organizing force of the South Side, which used to be, block clubs. A lot of resident-led organizing through block clubs. But because of the, housing crash, a lot of the blocks were decimated. And because of the aldermatic fragmentation in Englewood, we have 5 wards. We wanted to bring residents together so that we can work towards holistic change in our neighborhood, despite the wards that we were from. So one of the first things that we did with RAGE is start So Fresh Saturdays. And so that's what I want to talk to you all about, because it was our effort to really reclaim and reframe how people access and think about, specifically in Englewood, public space and then Chicago Park. And one of the things that we did, we decided to just take over a park. And then that led to us also wanting to take over all 7 of the parks. And how we take over the park is with free food, music. We invite other organizations to have tables to share community resources. And then most of all, we have local artists who perform. So we call it our little traveling Coachella. And we do this all throughout the summer, every few weeks. And the next one is actually coming up next Saturday at Murray Park. And what we do, as you can see, we have artists who come and they do live painting, they perform, children who, have a little dance group or a little singing group. We invite them to, do a performance in front of their peers in the neighborhood. And then also, we have bouncy houses, of course, free food. But it was really important for us to do this so that we can help residents learn how to access this public space. Because not only in Englewood do you have to deal with the negative perception of just crime and poverty, but a lot of residents, believe and they take that in and don't feel as though they can actually access public spaces due to feeling endangered. And so we really wanted to shift that mindset and help people not only take over these spaces, but teach them how to be able to do it. And so by them coming to So Fresh Saturdays, they were curious about how were you able to do this? You all are residents. Did your organization do it? So we're able to inform them on how to get to know the park staff, how you can actually, host your own event. And we will share with our network if you want to create a little flyer and do so. One of the other things that we did in reference to vacant lots is we actually initiated and helped start the Dollar Large Lot program. By a show of hands, how many of you all are familiar with the Dollar Large Lot program? Perfect, so I don't have to give you the whole history. And before the city actually made it citywide, it started in Englewood, and it was primarily because as residents, we were frustrated with the fact that our community had just become taken over by vacant lots. And because of the limited public space, we have those 7 park districts, but we really wanted to create public spaces for the neighborhood. And one way to do that was to have access to vacant lots. And so we wanted to help create a way to make that accessible to the homeowners that are in Englewood. And I'm going to show you some of the ways in which Englewood residents who did purchase their vacant lot have created and reimagined it and made it a public space for the community. Mekazin, she actually took a long time to transform 2 vacant lots. Not only did she have a meditative garden and then an actual garden where you can go and get produce, but then she also put in a built-in stage. So really the concept of a park space, she just recreated with her 2 vacant lots. And this is them working on it, and oh, that's the next one. But this is her working on it, and as you can see, she was really excited to have the stage. And so it is really important for residents to not only have ownership of the vacant lots, but how they use it creates hope, and then it also kind of shows other residents that this is what you can also do. Another large lot owner who is also a participant in my Folded Map project, Tina Hammond. They call their vacant lot the Promised Land. And the reason that they do that, yes, the reason that they call it the Promised Land is because not only is it a gathering space, but it's just completely beautiful. You could literally have a wedding there. And a lot of people want to have baby showers there, and she lets them do so. We've used it as a space to have volunteers come together who want to do block cleanups. And it is really a multi-purpose location, as well as just a peaceful location. And yes, as you can see, she titles it the Promised Land. But she really wanted to help make it a space where the youth could come and learn about flowers, where they can learn about just cleaning up their neighborhood, and then also helping other residents who want to utilize it as an event space, how to contribute to helping people make their event space even that much more better.
Thank you so much. Give Tanika a hand. All right.
It was a hard stop, but yes, we'll get into the rest.
Yeah. We're going to come back to a number of more things.
Yeah.
But next we're going to introduce Brian McCamick. He is a professor at the Lake Forest College and in charge of the Department of Urban Studies, if I understand correctly, and the author of Landscapes of Hope, Nature and the Great Migration in Chicago. I was reading it by the pool at the conference I just came back to. He said, this is kind of heavy reading for the pool. I go, it was, but it's really, really good. And it's going to be for sale afterwards, so I encourage you towards it. And he's going to give us some background on the African-American community relationship and history with nature and what they brought to Chicago and what the realities of segregation in Chicago meant for all of that. So.
Yeah, and I think Tanika's slide about the Hammonds' Promised Land, hear me? Did I cut out? Is a nice segue, actually. Because many migrants from the South thought of Chicago. Is it still cutting out? Can I just put it here? Is that fine? Is that better with the wireless?
Right, it's good. We can hear you.
Are we good now?
Yep.
All right, so the Hammondses and the Promised Land, many migrants from the South considered Chicago and other great migration destinations the Promised Land. And it's hard to overestimate just how profoundly the Great Migration transformed Chicago. And the book just covers the period between 1910 and 1940, between World Wars I and II. That's a period when Chicago's African-American population more than sextupled, from roughly 44,000 to more than 250,000, and the share of Chicago's African-American population as a proportion of total population rose from about 2%, give or take, to about 10%, give or take. There were even more profound changes after World War II, which the book doesn't get into, but I'm sure will come up in discussion. Chicago's African-American population by 1970 has reached 1 million, about a third of the city's total population, as many white Chicagoans are leaving for the suburbs, dramatically changing the racial makeup of the city. And what the book tries to do is uncover just how those Southern understandings of the environment inflected the way migrants understood and experienced and fought for environments in Chicago. So to pick up on Mary Sue's point about the centennial celebration, not celebration, but observance of the the 1919 race riot and Eugene Williams's death in Lake Michigan, his murder at the hands of a white man. Eugene Williams, the 17-year-old, was originally from Georgia, right? Looking for ways to experience the urban environment on a 95-plus degree day. And it's hard to overestimate just how Southern in character Chicago's African-American population was in this period in the 19-teens, 20s, and 30s. More than 75% of African-Americans in Chicago had been born in the South. You were as likely to have been born in Mississippi as you were to have been born in Chicago if you were an African-American in Chicago in the interwar period. So to understand how Black Chicagoans interacted with green spaces in the city in that period, you have to understand Southern culture. So just a few, I'm going to flip through a bunch of slides here. I included like 30 slides because I love the images so much. That's one of my favorite parts of the book, uncovering a lot of these images from the archive. But I wanted to go back to this image in particular. It's the image that I really wanted to be the cover of the book. My publisher pushed back on that. You see these two kids there fishing in the lagoon at Washington Park. We don't know if they were Southern born or not, right? But you think about the ways that African Americans in Chicago translated interactions with the environment in the South to the North. You're not fishing in a fishing hole anymore, right? You're looking for places to fish in the city and continue those cultural practices in the city. You're now fishing in a lagoon, right? Or Lake Michigan. And we know that these practices are still carried through to the present day, right? These are cultural practices that are handed down through the generations. So fishing, church picnics, all of these kinds of activities that are characteristic of the South, a much more rural and much more spread out environment. Even if you were a migrant who had come from, say, Birmingham or Atlanta, these were still much more rural towns than Chicago. Chicago was the second largest city in the nation behind New York at that point. And I can't remember the statistic I used in the introduction of the book exactly, but if you put together all like the 3 or 4 most populous cities in the South in the 19-teens and 20s, put them all together, Chicago is still way bigger than those cities in the South, right? So the character of the urban experience, even if you had come from a city in the South, was much more rural, much more spread out. These were small towns, right? And you're coming to the big city and trying to figure out how to utilize these park spaces. So a couple more examples that I'll give really briefly, and then shut up, because I have a tendency to go on as an academic. A couple of examples I use in the book are Lorraine Hansberry, the playwright of A Raisin in the Sun, has a great little memory vignette in an autobiographical snippet, remembering how her parents, who were both migrants from the South, would sit in the parks in Chicago. They would look up at the stars, and she remembers hearing stories about the South being passed down to her. Right? So these were places where cultural memory was passed down. Mahalia Jackson, the gospel singer from New Orleans, has these memories of fishing on the off the levees in New Orleans in the Mississippi River. Right? Well, again, the fishing is not happening, certainly not in the Chicago River at this point. I mean, you could, but it would not be advisable, still not today. Fishing happens in the lagoons, happens along Lake Michigan, right? So migrants are finding ways to translate their connections to the natural world built in the South to an urban environment, right? And they see the Great Migration as a chance to realize connections to the environment that were denied to them in the South, in part, right? Again, seeing the North as the promised land. But we know, and the race riot of 1919 is the perfect example of this, that African American migrants to the city found contested spaces in these green spaces wherever they turned. So if I can back up to this map from Black Metropolis really quickly, you can kind of see how the front of racial violence in park space changed over the course of several decades. So 29th Street Beach is at the very top of this map, where the riot started in 1919. Eugene Williams drowned after getting hit in the head with a rock. By 1929, within a decade, and really even within just a few years, 29th Street Beach is considered an African-American beach, de facto African-American beach. The reason Eugene Williams got a rock thrown at him was that he had floated too far south into what was considered a white beach at 29th Street in 1919. Just a few years later, that becomes a de facto African-American beach as African-American neighborhoods are extending further south. And it's so much so an African-American beach, and this is essentially where 31st Street Beach is today, where the 1919 commemorations are going on Saturday, and you should definitely all go to those commemorations. It is so much so considered an African-American beach by that point that the Chicago Recreation Commission, a governmental agency publishing documents to advertise parks to Chicagoans and people who are visiting the city, designates 31st Street Beach in print as Negroes only, quote unquote Negroes only. And this is the North, right? This is where African Americans are coming to try to get away from Jim Crow. And we know that that wasn't the case in many different ways. And Tanika's Folded Map project really dramatically illustrates that, right? The effects of that over the course of generations and generations. But this becomes an African-American beach, and the front of racial conflict just extends further south. By the 1930s, it's Jackson Park Beach. A fence is erected sort of in the middle towards the north end of Jackson Park Beach. African-Americans being kept to the north end of that beach, whites using the bigger, more, just better part of the beach for themselves. Battles erupting further south there. By the 1960s and 70s, right, you have wade-ins at Rainbow Beach Park further south, and that is tracking the way African-American neighborhoods continue to extend south and east. Right?
So I want to play on that and mention, Mary Sue mentioned the Parks as Democracy Conference that Friends of the Parks does. And very clearly, let me point out, we call it our Parks as Democracy ? Conference, because we are actually not trying to suggest that we necessarily believe that parks are democratic spaces. It's a phrase that you hear a lot in the parks world, but when I started at Friends of the Parks, I started asking, well, what does that really mean, and does a park as a democratic space ring true in every community? And I said to my board of directors, being from Humboldt Park, my park is a battleground around gentrification, and it doesn't necessarily feel like a democratic space in my neighborhood. And at our first Parks as Democracy conference a couple of years ago, Tim Yule Black came and told a story of the wade-ins at Rainbow Beach and how that park represented, for many people who are still around, not having free access to your park. So in that context, what does it mean for a park to be a democratic space? We've taken that conversation forward and been spending time trying to document the inequities in our parks, and last year released our 2018 State of the Parks report, in which we lifted up a lot of inequities that we saw, with the African American community being the least invested in as of all communities in terms of programming, and the Latino community being the least invested in terms of acreage of parks and capital investment. And the highlight of this report was something that kind of looked a little bit like the folded map, so I want to hand it back to you and let you say a few more words before we open it up for questions. But we looked at an area on the north side, which was the most invested area in terms of park programming, and it had something like 3,000 units of park programming, and an area on the south side, and it had about 300, right? That's how big the difference was. And this is programming that the park district was making available. Now, there are community groups doing additional things on top of that, but our argument is that the community's things, though wonderful in community building, should not replace the government investment in the programming in that space. And that made us think of your folded map project. So tell us a little bit more about the folded map and a couple more pieces about your work, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. And there are going to be microphones, although I can't see where they will be. But back there somewhere. All right.
So my folded map project utilized Chicago's actual grid map to find mirroring points on the same streets that exist in Inglewood, my home neighborhood, and on the north side, and identified similar addresses to photograph them and show just the difference, the visual difference. But then also having residents who live on these same streets but different sides of town actually meet each other to talk about how did they come to live in their neighborhood, and the disparity, if there is any. And so just in relationship with park space, not only is it just a difference in investment, which also contributed to, I feel, why residents in Inglewood and in neighborhoods like it on the south side don't access the park space, but also it's really important to mention the hyper-policing that occurs. And so park spaces aren't viewed as a place of relaxation and freedom because of the hyper-policing. And so that the treatment of residents when they enter the park space on the south side is also a huge inequity. And I think the most glaring example that we can all refer to now is the Netflix special, When They See Us. That happened in a public park space, and that is something that has definitely happened in Chicago, in Inglewood, and neighborhoods like it. And so when you have all of those things coming together, it's not only about just programmatic investment, but the treatment of residents when they exist in these spaces. And particularly African Americans, I remember growing up, that's where you had your family reunions. We utilized park space. You had family reunions at, the Dan Ryan Woods or whatever park that was near your house. But definitely in the 90s, that I noticed personally a change. And it wasn't just because of the perception of crime, it was also just the treatment, the policing, and that really contributes to how residents feel like they can access those spaces. And Folded Map does highlight not only park districts, but also bus stops, how that is inequitable. So yes.
As we invite you to come to the microphone, I think it's been set up right here. I'll just point out there was an article, I think it was just today in the paper, or maybe yesterday, about a woman from the South Side who's organizing a special, I can't remember what she called it, but a North Side beach takeover at Foster Beach, not this weekend, but next weekend, because of what seems to be over-policing of the beaches on the South Side. And she went to the beach, and the police said, you can't come in, and they said it was full, and they needed to leave room for emergency vehicles. But, the story was in Block Club Chicago, so take a look at it. It'll be on our Facebook page, maybe tomorrow. And it talks about, well, are we really sure that it's just that there's no space, or is it really an over-policing issue? And so they're going to take the party up to Foster Beach next Saturday, so maybe go check out a good party. Does anyone want to ask a question? We can keep talking if you don't have any questions, but
maybe while people are coming up, I could
go ahead up to the microphone and go ahead and say a few more words, Brian, while we get people up at the microphone.
Okay, I was just going to pick up on this question of investment in parks and point out one little vignette from Washington Park, which, as you can see from this map, by about 1930 is surrounded on two sides by predominantly African American neighborhoods, and by about 1930, Washington Park becomes essentially a de facto African American park. There really aren't too many white Chicagoans using Washington Park. And one of the key amenities that Washington Park gets during the Depression is the pool that's still on the west side of the park, right here, just east of Garfield Boulevard. And sorry, this is kind of a busy slide, but the swimming pool opened in 1937. That only happened after a massive infusion of funds from the New Deal. Washington Park residents, African American residents, had been fighting for more amenities in the park for decades and actually wanted a field house. Community groups wanted a field house that could be used year-round instead of the pool that can only be used 2 or 3 months of the year. And their wishes were just completely ignored, right? Now, why were they ignored, right? I don't want to minimize how much of a boon to Washington Park residents and more broadly in the Black Belt that pool was, right? It's a multi-million-dollar investment when it opens in 1937. It's the largest pool in the city of Chicago. But one of the stories I tell in the book is that if you go back and look at the letters to the editor and in the Tribune and the Chicago Defender from this period, a letter writer who signs the letter, Jimmy Farrell, who I'm almost 100% certain is the author James T. Farrell, who wrote extensively about the South Side, makes this argument, why don't we just put a pool in Washington Park so African Americans don't want to go to Jackson Park Beach anymore, right? And lo and behold, a decade later, that's what happens, right? So even these amenities that go into parks have a way of reinscribing these patterns of residential segregation. That's why I was so excited to be on a panel with you, Tanika, because I think it all comes back to residential segregation, right? People obviously do travel to parks, but at the end of the day, more often than not, people tend to recreate in the places where they live, right? So if we don't live together, we tend not to play together either. And I think this is one really vivid example that's just a stone's throw away from here.
Yeah. And then also, I just think it's the fact that investment follows young white professionals. And so if investment were to occur in black neighborhoods, then that would also not only be incentive for other people from different neighborhoods to want to visit, these specific locations, but, it would also just show that we value your existence in your space, in your neighborhood. And really, it's just the trail of investment, how it just continues to follow a specific demographic. And that, perpetuates the segregation, the residential segregation as well.
On that note, do you want to say couple words about the Englewood Trail, and then we'll go to the microphone, because I know you wanted to get a word
yes,
in
the
about
Englewood Trail. Okay, so it is unofficially the Englewood Trail, which is a rail line that extends about 2 miles from the Dan Ryan all the way towards like Western. And so it is really something that we in Englewood want to be the anti-606, because it is actually filled with grass. And so since it's elevated, it's closer to all of the trees. And so you literally feel like you are dropped in like Alice in Wonderland. And so people in the community have been using this trail. Like, they showed us how it can be used. They travel on it to go a few blocks down. It's just very peaceful. You have a different kind of ecosystem there. You have all the butterflies. You hear the birds because you're closer to their nest. And we definitely would love investment to build out that trail. But then it comes,
Don't tell anybody.
Exactly. But you want people to come, but then it's also the issue of what does that mean economically for the community. But Englewood does have an unofficial trail that you all should definitely visit. On August 2nd, I believe, one of the Chicago Park District programs, youth programs that I work with, Trace, and Young Cultural Stewards, they're actually going to be hosting their culminating event. This is youth that are involved in Park District programs, and it's going to be on 59th and Halsted, which is one of the entry points to this trail. And so not only will you get to see youth who still, do park programming, but you'll be able to actually go up and visit the trail. So I invite you to do that.
All right, we'll go to the questions and try to make it brief so that we can hear more from our panelists.
Sure. So in light of, what's great about this panel is that you all represent very distinct experiences in different parts of the city, or maybe studying different parts of the city. We have experiences with vacant lots and gentrification and being displaced in Humboldt Park. We have Englewood at vacant lots, reclaiming space, making it public, accessible, and welcoming. And then we have studying maybe people of different backgrounds and cultural backgrounds coming to Chicago and how they interact in Chicago. But I think what I'd like to ask is, we know that the problem of not having access to green spaces and not having access to accessible, welcoming public spaces isn't an issue that exists in silos. It's a very nationwide issue and definitely a citywide issue. So I'm going to leave this question a little bit open so that you all are free to just speak to your experience. So in your perspectives, are there certain areas of this specific topic that you think cut across all different demographics, sides of the city, regions, neighborhoods, et cetera, that are shared problems? And are there any things that we should be aware of as distinct to certain areas, or maybe certain groups that we should be mindful as we continue working and improving on this topic?
Well, you can definitely help inform if this is even accurate. But I think one issue that cuts across all of the issues is funding. You know, it's very similar to our educational system. A lot of people don't really get how public schools are funded and why certain schools have more resources. And I think that same issue is also reflected when it comes to public space park districts. And I think that is also what we need to be more informed about so that we can come up with solutions and suggestions. But there are people who study how all of that works. So maybe,
Yeah,
what do
and
you?
let me just add to that. My answer that I come up with at the top of my head is related, and it comes out of the experience around the fight over Lincoln Yards. And you know, we came at that as a parks-related organization, but I come from an affordable housing background, and you know, we ended up very, very happy. That whole thing is not over, but very happy to be in coalition with people who were worried about privatization, not just about parks, you know, but privatization of schools, and the whole question of should TIF dollars be used for this? Is it a blighted community? Is it not a blighted community? And so we have been excited to see people finding the common themes around privatization and then coming together to talk about that more. So come to our Parks is Democracy Conference, October 4th and 5th, because we're really going to talk about that. And one of the things that we are trying to do is connect people who come from different starting points. You know, we're hoping it's not just a bunch of people who think of themselves as parkies or parktivists, but people who may start from other entry points on those conversations. So we'll take the next question.
Okay, so how much of this limited access to park space do you relate to the long-standing segregation in this city? Because I believe that if young people in this city, myself included, could afford to live wherever I wanted to, because I can't afford to move out of my dad's house at the moment, could afford to live wherever we wanted, the city would be 1,000 times more integrated. And do you think that would solve a lot of these issues if we were more integrated and less segregated as we traditionally have been?
I'll let Brian take this one.
I mean, I sort of already indicated this, but I think it all does come back to residential segregation. To use one historical example of Madden Park, which is a now defunct park, which used to be up at 39th Street and MLK. I gotta get through all these slides here to get you a picture of Madden Park. It took community activists in what was an overwhelmingly African-American neighborhood in the 19-teens and 20s to get Madden Park built. And that speaks to the importance of community activists throughout history in Chicago to get anything done, right? And the uneven footing that African-American groups often find themselves as compared to more, you know, well-supported, moneyed interests of white groups, right? It took like a decade to get Madden Park built up into anything more than sort of the vacant lot that you see there. It becomes a community space, again, de facto African American, because you're talking about a neighborhood that is almost exclusively African American. And at the time that they're putting the park, where they're deciding where to put this park in what was and still is in large part a very parks poor area of the city, you have community residents saying, look, I don't want this to become a race park, right? I don't want this to become essentially a Jim Crow park. But, you know, and the defender says, oh, it's not going to become a Jim Crow park, right? But that's essentially what it becomes because you have such marked residential segregation, right?
Yeah, and then just, you know, integration isn't the answer. It's not the solution. What is the solution is equitable investment in all neighborhoods, because only when neighborhoods are invested in equally and have the same resources, the same business corridor, the same entertainment, that's when people will consider a variety of different neighborhoods. And so one of the questions that I ask my folded map participants, which is, you know, something you should think about as well, is how did you come to live in your neighborhood? Because when you decide what neighborhood you want to live in, you think about the resources, you think about the cost, and the cost is influenced by the resources. So only equitable investment first can help unravel segregation.
And I can't answer that better than that, so I'm going to move on to the next question.
Hi. So I think that for any public space, and specifically open spaces, to be successful, we need the ownership and stewardship of the community. So my question to you is, how can we build that stewardship of open spaces when Black and brown communities or individuals sometimes want to be invisible in those open public spaces? And my question comes from all the issues with immigration lately, where we have in Little Village people who are afraid of going out to the streets, or we have African American youth afraid of driving or cycling through the city, afraid to being stopped by the police. So again, how can, as community, build that ownership and stewardship on our public and open spaces?
Well, I guess I would want to know kind of like specific examples in which African Americans haven't. In my experience, we've always accessed public space or made a way in public space to have relaxation, entertainment, but it is the treatment that we receive that prevents us from continuing to do that. I know cycling, that's nothing new in the Black community. I grew up with Black boys and girls who built their own bikes, who always have been like cyclists. And actually using the park spaces, like I said, it was a tradition in Black culture, specifically in Chicago, to have your family reunions at park spaces. So I can definitely like rattle off a list of ways in which the Black community in Chicago has utilized public spaces, but we won't be able to, let's say, rally around inclusion, more inclusive use of public space until we rectify the treatment that residents get when they're doing these things. So for me, it's more so about the hyper visibility residents have when they're in these open public spaces, and then the treatment, the policing, or just the interactions with others. So I think that has to be kind of addressed first. But definitely community activists are working together to get residents who don't utilize those spaces more involved. RAGE is one of them. There's a lot of other organizations in other smaller communities that are similar to Inglewood, where they're doing the exact same thing. So it is going on. So one key is to know that it's happening.
And I think it is both and. I think sometimes the things that we are doing as communities doesn't get the credit that it deserves. On the other hand, there are the challenges of policing and immigration. While I was out at the conference, I was with a fellow Chicagoan who helps to manage some community garden spaces, and he got a call from a group that was afraid to gather that day for fear that there would be immigration raids at their community garden, right?
Yeah.
And so they checked some things and figured out that legally they could lock the gates and tell ICE they couldn't come in if they did come in. But so these are real fears for communities, and so it's really the intersectionality of lots of public policy issues that we need to fight together. I think we probably only have time for one more question. We need to wrap it up.
Suggestion, if you each do a 15-second version of your question, you can take a few.
Okay.
Yes or
15
no
seconds,
questions only.
really quick.
Start the clock. All right. So let's say I'm not from a certain community, but I want to help. I'm wondering best ways to go about it without imposing or developing a savior complex.
Yeah, that's great.
Also, that was my question.
Yeah.
Cool.
Should we answer that quick? Take them a few more, and then we'll answer one last. Okay. Yeah.
So I live on the southwest side of the city by McKinley Park, and currently we're dealing with a huge environmental issue. We have a mad asphalt plant they're asking for a 5-year permit. What words of encouragement or what advice would you have for community groups and the community to help stop this plant? Because 5 more years of this plant there is that they put in for operational permit, it's gonna tear down the park, I think. So we'll let's get some advice.
My question is pretty much relating to, I'm currently working on a project trying to reactivate a park that was previously used for agriculture purposes, but over the period of time in the neighborhood has declined. And I'm working with one of the co-founders of that space, which used to be a Sharon Williams waste site and got reclaimed and was able to get restored into a green space. And I just wanted a few words of advice to try to get the community involved in trying to reactivate the space, and what ways could you get people specifically of color to learn more or want to learn about things such as the natural environment that Illinois used to once be, which is the prairie state. So how to get people connected to the origin of what this place used to be, and how to create that connection between the people that are in that community now.
So my friends that are here from the Environmentalists of Color group, go talk to him.
My name's Armani Thomas. Come find me. I'm wearing a Chicago Park District hat, and I work for the Park District as well.
How do we improve and open up park spaces without that being the first step of gentrifying those communities?
Naomi Davis, Blacks and Green, for the record. I want to say, and this is regarding segregation, that for the record, there's a difference between making people live in a particular neighborhood and people choosing to live amongst themselves as a heritage enclave. And when we talk about segregation as a problem, we do the Black community a disservice. Structural racism was then, has been, and continues to be the real problem. And so when you suggest that Black people living together is a problem without unpacking it, you're not saying Chinatown should be integrated, Greektown should be integrated, Little Italy should be integrated, Russian enclave should be integrated. Do not presume to tell us that our neighborhoods need to be diverse, because what that is saying is a Black neighborhood can only be improved by adding whites. How insulting is that?
So I'll start with that one first. I know specifically for me, when I talk about, and I don't even talk about integration, I talk about how our city's resources follow a specific demographic. That's what I talk about. And I am including all neighborhoods as integration, like that would be helpful. But it's not just integration. For people who want to live in neighborhoods where people look like them, have the same values as them, that's completely fine. However, there has to be equitable resources. And then also, for Chicago to have such a diverse demographic and population, we don't have not one diverse neighborhood. So the option should exist. There should be options for living in a diverse neighborhood. There should be options for living in a strong African American enclave. However, it should not come at the expense of African Americans having to over-invest and fight for resources. And I think once we see equitable investment in all of the neighborhoods, then we'll actually see what people choose. We've never had that. We've never had that. So I can't say that the Black communities that do exist, that have strong histories, are the result of us choosing. It isn't. So I'm just more interested in resources being more equitable and just fair. And also to kind of go to the point of how you enter a space or a neighborhood without the savior complex. A question that I asked folded map participants, or a commentary that has come up, is they actually felt they viewed neighborhoods differently because they were visiting someone without volunteering, not because it's related to work. They were visiting just another resident. They were just going to their home. So I would suggest just doing that. Not necessarily volunteering, but if you do want to volunteer, volunteer on something that's already existing, that's resident-led, and start there. And then just one other thing about the gentleman that said the park space that he was trying to reactivate, just find out why residents stop utilizing that space, if you can, because that will inform some of the solutions that you might come up with in helping them do whatever it is they want, because you don't even know anything about that as of yet. They might have an actual reason why they don't use that they don't even want to use that space. So just, you have to go into it learning about the residents and the reasons why they aren't using that space, and not imposing or projecting on your assumptions.
Brian, you want to answer a few and then I'll wrap us up?
Yeah, I would just pick up on the last question. I mean, that is one of the key arguments of the book, right, is the way Black Chicagoans were able to make some place like Washington Park, Madden Park, the Dan Ryan Woods, resorts and camps in Michigan, culturally productive, generative places. I mean, the way that the historian Earl Lewis talks about this is congregation amidst segregation, right? So much of the book is about how African Americans made that culturally productive space and sought out nature, whether in a segregated or integrated environment. Always fighting for equal access and equal opportunity and equal funding, right? But I mean, this is how you get something like the Bud Billiken Day Parade, which is celebrating, what, 80, 90 years at this point? I think started in 1930. Yeah, I would just say that if I came off as saying that, you know, segregation or black people together is bad, that's not what I intended at all, right? So much of the book is about that cultural production in those spaces.
Yeah.
So I will wrap us up with a couple of quick responses and then a little bit of a summary. But I know Friends of the Parks has been in contact with the Neighbors for Environmental Justice in the McKinley Park asphalt plant issue. So we'd be happy to keep talking to you about that and see where we can be supportive wherever he went. Definitely an important issue to keep fighting. Number two, a friend of mine in Humboldt Park, Logan Square, who's an older white gentleman. He's an artist who lived for many years in Wicker Park, and then got priced out of Wicker Park and ended up literally on the block of what is now the 606, so right on the edge of Logan Square and Humboldt Park. And he was one of the founders of Operamatics, which does some really neat work in parks with the community. And something that he said is, I really like to repeat it because I find it so beautiful. And he tells other white folks like himself who move into the neighborhood, say, don't come to the neighborhood to change the neighborhood, let the neighborhood change you. And I just love that. So Mark Messing, he's an awesome guy. You should know him. And finally, I'll just close by talking a little bit about the investment and equity pieces that Tanika has also mentioned. You know, one of the challenges in Chicago is that we do not have equitable investment in a lot of ways. We do have a new mayor, and we have some opportunities to hopefully change the way we do some things. But having just come back, as I've mentioned, from the City Parks Alliance Conference, I heard the head of the New York Park District talk about how they're changing things around equitable investment. I heard San Francisco talk about there are ways that they came up with equity zones and how they are prioritizing investment in parks in equity zones. I heard the mayor of Denver talk about that. I heard the mayor of Greenville, South Carolina talk about how they're creating this big park in a neighborhood that's been African American since the early 30s and has needed a park, and now there are $1 million condos coming up alongside the park, and so the city decided that they needed to donate more land for affordable housing. We need leadership in Chicago that is thinking about those things, and I think we do now have a mayor who says she cares about those things, and we all need to make sure that we are pushing for that, because we tend to think in Chicago that this is the way it has to be because that's the way it's been. And I'm going to take some lessons from my people in Puerto Rico. And, you know, just because it's been a certain way doesn't mean it has to continue, and we don't have to accept it. And we, you know, I think we've heard some of that in our most recent mayoral election as well. And again, we need to keep pushing. There are other cities out there that are trying to do it better. And we need to take some of those examples. And there's a brand new report that the City Parks Alliance just came out on ways that other cities are doing equitable park investment. So we're really looking forward as Friends of the Parks, and I know MPC staff have asked me questions about that too, on how we can change that here in Chicago. So with that, we'll say thank you so much to our wonderful panelists.
Very last slide, thank you. And I will be very brief with my thank yous. What a fabulous discussion between the three of you, but also with all of you. I'm glad we got to even speed through some of those questions, because it gives you a sense of the context, the ideas, the grappling that we're all doing with how to do this better, how to celebrate the history, the spaces, and recreate and co-create the spaces that our communities need. Equitable development is a watchword. I'm so glad that our panelists all emphasized that. It is the guiding star for the Metropolitan Planning Council's work, informed by the cost of segregation. So we're celebrating our 85th year this year as an independent entity. We kind of sit at the intersection of every day working with community and civic leaders, people in government and people in the private sector, who all, I think, are united in wanting to put the assets of this great place we call home together in a much more powerful way. We know this region and this city is not working for everyone, and we know it has that potential. So we've got a bunch of strengths. I heard the passion tonight from Juanita, from Brian, and from Tanika. Thank you all for the heart that you put into this conversation. And for all of you, the fact that so many people wanted to be part of this evening makes me extremely optimistic about what we can achieve with those leaders. But we can't just look to those leaders to lead the way. We have to own that. The Equity in Action Conversation Series will continue. You'll see some information up here. If you're not already on the mailing list, perhaps you were encouraged to come here with a friend. Please pass on to any of us at MPC, including me, your card or your information. We've got your name on the sign-up sheet, and we'll be sure to invite you to upcoming things like on August 15th, learning from some affordable housing design competitions about how to build housing more affordably. We've got our MPC annual luncheon on September 19th. In the fall, we'll be hosting Alex Kotlowitz about his newest book, and more. So those ideas come not from our staff alone, but from our partnerships. And we're grateful to the Field Foundation for sponsoring this evening event, and to our hosts at the DuSable Museum. I hope you will continue to ask questions informally, both of our panelists and of each other. Thank you so much for being part of making this region more equitable.